Well, welcome again to this series about the history of the Scottish Church. And the previous one we looked at, we talked about the Presbyterian Church and how, in the time of the Covenanters, they paid heavily for the freedom of faith in Scotland. And finally, it did come, and the Church of Scotland Presbyterian Christian democratic system was reinstated after being away for almost 100 years, and it was re-established in 1690. That was a really key part of our history, and of course the Presbyterians celebrated. It was wonderful to have that freedom again. But it wouldn't take very long before they would be challenged yet again, and this time it was the year 1707. And what happened was that the two governments came together in the Union, and so we were essentially ruled government-wise from Westminster with representatives from Scotland. But what tended to happen was that the Presbyterians were a bit concerned at first because they thought, oh no, are we going to lose our freedom again? We've only just won this back. And they were given guarantees. Oh, it's set in stone. It's in law. We promise. So the Presbyterians thought, that's fine, that's great. They trusted the newly formed government. But it was only 5 years after that, in the year 1712, the Patronage Act was introduced, which meant not just England but Scotland too. And this caused a big problem. What it meant was that the landowner would be the person who would be choosing and paying for the minister of the local congregation in Scotland. And that would mean that potentially you could even have a landowner who was an atheist or very liberal, and the choice of pastor that would suit him most of all would be the most liberal pastor. And the congregation, who was supposed to have the democratic right to vote and choose their own leader, would not be able to do so. It would be all above their heads. So you can understand when this Patronage Act was enforced on the people in Scotland, that the pastors were really upset about it, and they petitioned the government again and again and again. We were promised, it's written in law and so forth, but the government just ignored it. And so now we have hit a problem. And some people refer to this as the Third Reformation. The first being the time of John Knox, when the church broke free from the tyranny of the papal system. The second being in the time of the Covenanters in the 17th century, when the Presbyterian Church broke free from the tyranny and control of the kings, trying to be head of the church. And now we're hitting a third problem with the government trying to control the church. And so this was something that would press on and on. Eventually, I think the pastors grew tired and weary of petitioning for so many years, and nothing seemed to happen. So in this particular time, you get the moderates, that's the liberals in the church, begin to dominate the church over what were called the high flyers. These were the evangelicals and traditional Christians. And so with this door open for the Patronage Act, it meant that liberals were very much welcomed, and they were starting to stream into the church. And what we find from this period onwards is they are more and more the majority voice in the Church of Scotland. So there were some benefits of the Reformation that were encouraged in Scotland this time, such as free speech and open discussion. However, with this came the opportunity to challenge biblical Christianity as well. And Edinburgh became known as the capital of the mind. We're entering the 18th century. It's called the Golden Age of Philosophy, of the Enlightenment. And places like Paris and London, the intellectuals were all gathering and discussing philosophy. And we saw a very big, strong movement took place in our capital city. And all around the old town, around the Royal Mile, there where typically intellectuals would gather after work. They would eat oysters, and they'd have their steaks, and they would drink red wine from France, which they loved. And they'd be discussing ancient philosophy of Epicurus and all these other ones, Plato and Aristotle, and also the rise of the new philosophy in the 18th century. Of the people particularly who spring to mind, the main voice being David Hume. And I need to, in this part, even though we're doing a history series about the church, I need to put in the backdrop of what was going on with the philosophy, the ideas that were coming through, and then we need to address more carefully about the church's reaction to it and what was going on in the church. So we begin with David Hume, and he was a rationalist, a philosopher, a librarian, and a scholar in Edinburgh. And in this revival of Greek philosophy that was spreading, those philosophers I mentioned there, you start to see the thinking moving away from a biblical understanding to a more of a Greek pagan understanding. And so just as Paris became a hotbed philosophy, David Hume went off there to be amongst the philosophers in 1734, and he discussed ideas with Voltaire and Rousseau and Buffon, amongst others. And what we see is a rising movement coming through, being influenced by Isaac Newton, the physicist, and Francis Bacon. And the idea that the universe is like a watch or something that's just all predictable and so on, that was converging together with the philosophy of the Greeks as well in all the discussions. And so what happens is that David Hume is agnostic. He's not really officially atheist, but agnostic. And he actually said that he never said such a foolish thing as to say there was no first cause. He just didn't know what the first cause was. So he's been sort of championed as an atheist, but actually really he was a skeptical philosopher who was more agnostic. Well, in his dialogues concerning natural religion, he later wrote that the cause or causes of order in the universe probably bear some remote analogy to human intelligence. So he was actually thinking maybe there is some sort of intelligence behind the universe, but he wasn't going to say it was necessarily God. And that's about as far as he could get. But what happened is that as a rationalist, he produced the first 3 volumes of his A Treatise of Human Nature between 1739 and 1740, in which he sought to introduce the experimental method of reasoning into moral subjects, he said. And he went further and sought to rationalize morality in the essays Moral and Political. And he actually wrote, and I quote from some of his statements, 1. All distinction betwixt virtue and vice is merely imaginary. 2. Justice has no foundation further than it contributes to public advantage. 3. Adultery is very lawful, but sometimes not expedient. 4. Religion and its ministers are prejudicial to mankind and will always be found either to run into heights of superstition or enthusiasm. 5. Christianity has no evidence of it being a divine revelation. 6. Of all the modes of Christianity, popery is the best, and the Reformation from thence was only the work of madmen and enthusiasts. So you can understand, having some of these statements, it was causing a big stir in Edinburgh and Scotland as people discussed these kind of things in the pubs and the coffee houses. So he had a huge influence, and in fact he set up something called the Select Society in 1754, which was in the Royal Mile, and it was people were invited to come along and join them as philosophers and debate and try and work everything out. And of course religion was being criticised, and it was a challenge, a deep challenge for the time for the church leaders. James Hutton was a second person who was really key during the Enlightenment in Scotland, and this was concerning the age of the earth. If you read back in Encyclopaedia Britannica, which was produced in Anchor Close off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, originally they just followed the traditional Christian understanding of the earth being around less than 10,000 years, of a great flood of Noah and so forth. But now James Hutton is challenging the whole thing, because what he's done is he's called the father of geology, and he travelled in Scotland examining the rocks and came to the conclusion that they had been laid down gradually over many millions of years. His book, Theory of the Earth, in 1788, was foundational to the rational movement, they called it, which rejected Genesis. Another Scotsman, called Charles Lyell, developed this work even further, made it more popular for people in his books, in his volumes, Principles of Geology. And he was actually the one, Charles Lyell, who coined the phrase uniformitarianism, which basically means the present is the key to the past in determining world's geology. So basically, if you see something happening, it's very gradual, so therefore it's always been very gradual. Interestingly enough, that's been challenged more recently, increasingly, by geologists who are actually observing things happening in our own lifetime, which happen very rapidly. And yet, so the discussion is coming back again about how we work these things out. But of course, when James Hutton started off with this theory and began to challenge Genesis and the global flood, you can imagine it caused a big stink amongst church leaders. There were liberals who kind of liked the idea and they really went with the flow, but there was a minority of voices that began to speak out and to challenge and say we need to re-examine everything and look at the evidence. And so that voice was essentially mostly squashed over the time. And so this was a key part, foundational part, because it was attacking Genesis. And therefore there was a growing mindset in Scotland and Edinburgh that was saying that, well, if you can't trust Genesis, and maybe you can't trust the rest of the book either. And so we start to find this rationalist movement spreading through the church. And a lot of the pastors were scrabbling around trying to find answers. So if James Hutton was the father of geology, challenging the age of the earth and the book of Genesis, a next person also is very significant, it's largely been forgotten, is a man called James Burnet. And he was one of Edinburgh's eccentrics in the 18th century. He was a High Court judge, and there are some funny incidents about him. For example, that one time he was a High Court judge on the Royal Mile, and it was pouring with rain. So he was very much influenced by the Spartans to be really tough in mind and body and soul. So he paid for a cabbie to drive his wig, which is very precious, put it in the carriage, and it was taken down the street to his house. But he insisted on walking himself without his wig and getting soaked to the skin. And he would actually have open-air baths in his garden, sort of a tub, and he would dive in it. And you have to break the ice to get in when it was winter, so he could toughen himself up to be like the Spartans. It was said by another High Court judge in the 19th century, a man called Lord Neves. He actually wrote a poem about Monboddo, that he was really the father of evolutionary thinking. And the poem goes something like this: though Darwin now proclaims the law and spreads it far abroad, the man that first the secret saw was honest old Monboddo. And continues like that. Give credit to the Scotsman rather than the Englishman. Back in 1768, the evolution had occurred, but from God. He was a theistic evolutionist, and that God worked the process through vegetation, through to lower animals, and then to the orangutan, and then finally to human beings. And there was Captain Cook's botanist who came to town in Edinburgh, and when he did that, he was so excited, he wanted to meet him, so he got him over for tea and asked him. One of his questions, he was convinced that there were people still living with tails in the world, and he was asking him, did the Aborigines in Australia have tails? Certainly not, sir, was the response. And so that was the typical kind of thing there. And of course, Lord Monboddo was ridiculed a lot and sidelined because of his insistence. He was convinced that there were human beings living with tails in the Bay of Bengal. But nevertheless, he was actually really influential at the time. And he wrote several volumes that promoted his understanding in what was called ancient metaphysics. But one person he had particular influence on was somebody called Erasmus Darwin, who was a grandfather of Charles Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin studied medicine at Edinburgh University, and he went on to go and write a book called Zoonomia, or The Laws of Organic Life. And this was really promoting evolutionary model. This is at the end of the 18th century. But he was a Freemason. He was a pantheist. He believed that God exists but is embedded in the universe rather than the creator of the universe. And this comes out in his poem called the Temple of Nature, which basically combined pagan mystery religion with evolutionary theory. And he was very clear that, as was Monboddo, the understanding was coming from the Greek philosophers, evolutionary ideas. So those two books had some impact, but it was actually his grandson, Charles Darwin, of course, would be the key person, who came and studied medicine like his grandfather and father beforehand at Edinburgh University. But he was only here for a couple of years because he didn't like the sight of blood, and there's no way that was going to work properly as a doctor. So he threw in his medical career and actually ended up doing theology. But later he was convinced about the argument of design from William Paley's watchmaker. But later on became somebody who rejected all that. And of course he wrote his famous book called Origin of Species, 1859, which promoted the idea that everything evolves from a common ancestor. And it opened up the way. You don't even need God at all. And it was very, very key in developing and encouraging atheism in our culture. So these ideas are very important as a backdrop to what's going on with the church. So another person in this particular time that was really key was Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith, he was a professor of philosophy, and he lived at the bottom of the street in a house called Panmure House in Edinburgh, and he was the father of modern capitalism. So he'd been a professor of philosophy at Glasgow University, and he retired in the city of Edinburgh. He wrote his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, in 1776. And in this he examined what had caused wealth in the world and believed it was through the encouragement of the free market economy rather than through protected national markets. And so that would have a massive impact on shaping our understanding of economics, both in the United Kingdom but also in America and many other nations. He was a deist. So typically these people, they believe that God exists, but he doesn't do anything. He doesn't do miracles today. He doesn't intervene with answers to prayers or anything like that. But he's just the one who lit the fuse at the beginning, and the universe kind of ticked on its own. So, yet he was inspired by Christian values as well, like a lot of them were. Well, the next point, which is really very influential in Edinburgh and Scotland at this time, was Freemasonry, which had its roots earlier, but it was called speculative Freemasonry. And Freemasonry emerged out of the medieval world, in which guilds were formed to set standards of quality in products. And they were actually part of the medieval church. For example, every guild would put on a play. People who were shipwrights, they would put on something about Noah and the flood. But as time went on in the 18th century, you start to find people questioning the reliability and the authority of the Bible. At the same time, people are going abroad. They're going to India. They're discovering Hindus who have a different religion. And they're going elsewhere and realizing, well, not everyone thinks the same way as we do. And so this opened up the way for people to speculate about spiritual and religious things. And this was going on in the Masonic lodges in Edinburgh, particularly the Canongate Lodge, which is the oldest surviving Masonic building in the world. And what happened there was that they would really discuss a lot of Greek philosophy, just like the philosophers were doing. And with their curiosity of they were digging out ancient Egyptian understanding. Nobody had deciphered at that point the hieroglyphics, so we could only know something about the Egyptian religions based on Roman historians or others, if it had been translated, if it was in Latin or Greek. But we couldn't translate the hieroglyphics. That would come later. But there was all this speculation about Egyptian religion and Hindu understanding and the Persians and the the Greeks and so on. And there was a sense of fusing together that with Christian understanding. So that typically, for example, you go into Masonic Lodge, you find a Bible, but it has a compass and set square on the cover, which means we have a Bible in Scotland, but it's actually interpreted through a Gnostic philosophy connected with all this speculation that was going on in the 18th century. So as this speculation arose in the Masonic lodges among the intellectuals, they were there free to explore all sorts of alternative ideas. And thus we see this philosophy system based on Gnosticism arising, which embraced many religions under the great architect or God. And this, of course, is another aspect which is significant that would follow through in our culture that would affect us today in the 21st century. Now, in this particular time, there was a man called John Robeson he's being labelled the father of modern conspiracy theories. And he was a professor of natural history or philosophy, which is the earlier name for science, at Edinburgh University. And he was a dedicated Freemason, but he started to get very concerned, in fact alarmed, at what he saw was beginning to happen, undermining Freemasonry and Western civilization. And so he came across documents that would get passed on to him concerning what were called the Illuminati, these people who were gathering together in the Masonic lodges, but they were trying to take over and trying to influence with their particular slant of understanding. And he thought he needed to blow the whistle, blow the trumpet and warn people. So he wrote about this in his book called Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe in 1798. And he said that what they're trying to do is forge and develop revolution in Europe and sort of hijacking the Masonic lodges as their means of doing this. So secret documents had been confiscated in Germany, revealing a plan to destroy Christianity through a process of liberalism, deism and atheism. The plan, as it was called, was to remove traditional marriage and family, private property and patriotism. So this, he said, would be replaced by a society inspired by Christ's teaching on liberty, equality and human rights on the surface, but actually would have an agenda to promote feminism, sexual freedom and a nanny state in which children would be owned by society and world control through an elite group based on Plato's ideas of a republic. And so obviously at that time there were people who they believed in that, others, a big discussion went on, others thought, no, that's too fanatical, that would never happen. And so he's been stuck with the label of the father of modern conspiracy theories. But it's up to you to examine that to see how far and how true he is or not. But next thing to mention as a backdrop here, as I've already referred to, is deism. That became a big issue in Scotland, as it did in Europe and in the church. And what we start to see in this period in the church is, with deism, the belief that God made the universe but doesn't do anything. It's like a kind of a mechanical clock. And again, the authority of the Bible is cast aside. Miracles are explained away. And we start to see compromise in the church, and we start to see division in the Church of Scotland. So this idea of deism was a belief inspired by Greek materialist philosophers, that God, or the gods, do not do miracles today, and that everything can be explained through a rationalistic way of understanding. So God was left as a remote, uninterested being who started creation, then remained aloof from it. This was the belief of people like James Hutton, the father of geology, and Adam Smith, the father of modern capitalism. But this philosophy also strangled the life of the church in Europe and Scotland. Increasingly, ministers turned aside from holding to the Bible as their authority in the pulpit, and they expounded the latest ideas. Many ministers also became Freemasons. Much of the Church of Scotland became either gripped by a legalistic attitude on the one hand, or a liberal attitude on the other. So we start to see a tension growing in the Church of Scotland here. And they had not heeded Christ's warning, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. That's the teaching of the legalists and the liberals. And so Christians found they got caught up in arguing about all sorts of issues like predestination and free will in this particular time, while the majority of the people in the city couldn't understand this very complicated argument, and it was going over their heads, and something really needed to happen. So in all of this confusion that was happening in our city of Edinburgh, for example, with all the confusion and the division, the general population fell into drunkenness and decadence, from the well-to-do to the poor. Contemporary records show that the city was on a slippery slope down into a moral morass. Alcohol consumption had grown tenfold between 1760 and 1790, with the Scots magazine of that time saying that Scotland is the most drunken nation on the face of the earth. Divorce and separation had become normal, brothels had multiplied 20-fold, and prostitutes on the streets by 100 times. Besides this, theft and housebreaking and crime had reached epidemic levels, and it was a serious demise and the collapse of our society that was happening. And even people like James Hutton, who went to church quite fairly regularly on the Sunday, you read his diary, he's often in a drunken stupor. He'll propose to somebody he wants to get married to, have a mistress on the side, and it'll also go to prostitutes as well. So it's a pretty dire situation we find ourselves in Edinburgh, thinking particularly more about this city. Well, there was an evangelical pastor called the Reverend John Witherspoon who emigrated to America and had a big influence there. In fact, he's the only pastor on the famous painting when the draft of the Declaration of Independence is put forward. And he's sitting on the right side there. And he was the only pastor represented in those key people for the Declaration of Independence. But he was very influential, and he had obviously come from Scotland. So he was one of the people who was speaking out against what was happening. And he wrote in his satire of the moderate pastors, he said, 1. All his subjects must be confined to social duties as opposed to religious doctrines. 2. There must be no reference to an afterlife. 3. His authorities must be drawn from pagan writers and none, or as few as possible, from the Holy Scripture. 4. He must be very unacceptable to the common people. In other words, completely out of touch with what was going on amongst the common people in the city and where they lived. So in this difficult situation we find ourselves during the Enlightenment, which was generally regarded between 1750 and 1800, it was so disturbing that a lot of Christians were concerned the church would disappear altogether in Scotland. There was an Edinburgh University student called Thomas Aikenhead who walked past the Tron Kirk in the Royal Mile in Edinburgh with his friends who were students, and he predicted in 1697 that Christianity would be extirpated by the year 1800. Unless a miracle happened, it would have been. And we're going to look at that next time, how there was a movement back to God at the time of John Wesley and George Whitefield, who both preached in Scotland.